You saw what how I had them work.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. How you make it out, guy?
Sorry for that diversion here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're good.
What we plan to do this afternoon is put together a presentation that puts together the history of hammered aluminum, and then in that context, the contribution of my father, Arthur Armour, to the hammered aluminum business, and focus in on some of the distinctive aspects that he contributed to this area of development of craft and the artistic aspects of this. And we're going to attempt to display the vision and the imagination as he attempted to apply his artistic talent to the media of steel die cutting, to the new metal at that time, in making aluminum products that were beautiful, functional, and domestic type items. And this is the focus of our discussion today. And it is in his honor that we give you all of this information. So let's begin. We'll need to have some lights off. As we begin, as you can see that my father was in production from 1933 to 1976 in Grove City, Pennsylvania. And he applied his artistic talent and skills to hammered aluminum, and he manufactured many different products in the same town that Wendell August was in. And in that context is that we're looking at Dad's shop. We made not so much in the manufacture of them himself. He would hire other people to do the manufacturing. And he would then oversee it all. After the Alcoa took over the patent and sold it to Alcoa, and they were making large quantities of aluminum.
The record button wasn't pressed.
This is a diagram of the process
And it would flash.
Reducing aluminum
And then
by
a minute or two, then it would just
and it made it
automatically
so
go
that
off.
the price of aluminum dropped drastically. As you can see, in 1852, aluminum cost $540. He had to maintain his equipment. Was that they did on the job, they got the job, but also they wanted to make the elevator doors. There's inside this building were some elevator doors, and they wanted them made out of aluminum. So the architect, I think, worked with Wendell August to make these doors, designed them and made the doors. And this is what they produced, was the doors to the elevator shaft inside that research building. Well, these were made differently than hand-forged aluminum. They were made by actually a process of, we call it repoussé. If you look a little closer at these doors, you'll see that they're the design pattern on them, and these were produced, and this is kind of the birth of the industry of making aluminum giftware. The people at Alcoa were very surprised that aluminum could be forged this way, and also repoussé, and so they got the job. They made these doors, And you see this design at the top of the doors is actually the design, or a very similar design, that's on the original trays that were made. And what happened was that once they had the doors made, the architect, Mr. Hornbostel, wanted 2 trays made to give to the president of Alcoa, which were done, and they gave these trays, and the president wanted 50 more. And then from there, the other executives in the thing, well, why don't we encourage them to make more things so that we could sell these things and use the aluminum. They also went to Kaufman's, and at Kaufman's they were selling giftware, and they said they could sell various giftware items. And so here's the tray that was actually made and given to the president of Alcoa. And then they started making other types of designs. This is Jim DePonso, who worked for Wendell August up in Brockway. And they cut a design. And it was actually Natal Rossi who had the idea of cutting the design into a steel plate. And then you could have texture in the base of the design, and then make various types of giftware with it. And then it was applied to various products. Kaufman's, the president, Mr. Kaufman, wanted a design made for a tray with his house on it. And that was the die, and this is the plate that was made. And over in Wendell August's booth is the actual original die and the plates that were made from it. There was one problem though, the design, the plate was only maybe a 1/4 inch thick, and when you started pounding on it, it bent, and they could only make a very few of them. You had to use thicker steel. Once they got this idea going, then they made other types of products. Well, this is about the time the Depression was going on, and Wendell August was making various products for banks, architectural design work, and there was a banker in Grove City, Pennsylvania, who had him do the bank in Grove City, and then eventually got him to move to Grove City, build him a building, and had him move from Brockway to Grove City. He brought with him 8 blacksmiths and a number of other people, and Jim McCausland, who was his designer, and brought them to Grove City and set up there. And that was in the April of 1932, and they were in production towards the end of the year. The products were written up in the Alcoa News in December issue 1932, and this is a picture of Mr. August and some of his products. They took it out of the Alcoa News, and they were displaying it down in Pittsburgh. So the industry was starting, was going very good at that time, and they had quite an operation going in Grove City after they moved there. Now I'd point out that you can't read it on this, but I do want to think it's interesting that the person that wrote this article went to visit there, and it's just what it says here is that indeed it does not require an extensive stretch of the imagination to surmise that today's examples of the handiwork of these general Grove City artisans will be the museum pieces of a later age. That's why you're here today. And that was written in 1932. How does Arthur Armour fit into this? At the same time, in 1931, my father graduated from Carnegie Tech and trained in architecture. And he came back to Grove City, where it was his home, and there was no work. It was 1931, in the midst of the Depression, and there just wasn't any work. He worked at an architectural firm in Newcastle for 1 year for $100. Then in the spring, Wendell August moved to Grove City, and in the fall, my father started working for him in October of '32. And his design characteristics, he was as a designer, and was designing various products for Wendell August, and he designed the decorations, the dies, and his concepts were somewhat different from Jim McCausland, who too was trained as an architect, and the two didn't quite have the same ideas. But my father was Scottish background. This is his great-grandfather and his father standing up, little boy in the top. The interaction between Jim McCausland, which was on the left, and then his window office on the right, they finally decided that my father should be laid off. This was in the spring of 1932, or 1933, and so he decided that he would do his own work. While he was at window office, he had some things that he designed, and this is one, a polo player, and the whole polo field, and a sailboat. This one, point out, is actually 2 sailboats, and there's some of these on display here. There's a sailboat here, and then there's a second sailboat, and they're racing. It doesn't read too well, and but it was a nice product too. He designed this one, and he designed the base of this coffee table. As you see that there's various curves and the methods of dealing with the aluminum, and actually the design. Made this design of a horse, and he's carried that over into his own work. So when he was laid off, he didn't have anything else to do, any other work, so he thought, well, I'll try to do it myself. And so he set about to make a drawing for a tray, and then cut a die. And this is the die, the first die that he cut. After cutting that die, he then made a product, which is this tray. This is the first tray that he made. There's a few of them floating around here for sale. Took that tray to the World's Fair in Chicago. In 1933, when he went to the World's Fair, he hitched a ride with some other people going, and then at the World's Fair he found a gift shop. There was a man that ran it, was Stanley Russell, and he showed him his trays, and then he said, well, he liked that. He'd seen window office things, but he hadn't any contact, and he said, well, can you make them? And my father said, yes, he can make them. He went back home and started making them, and he needed a place to do that, and that's where Dad's shop came from. Across the street, the back alley, actually, from his house, there was this pop factory that had been converted into an apartment complex of 2 apartments, one upstairs, one downstairs, and it had been vacant because of the Depression. So he rented it for $10 a month, and he started production of those trays and similar type items. Just a little history further with the shop is that approximately after the war, he purchased the shop, and then had to purchase the house and such associated with it, and then later on the people wanted to buy the house, and he sold it, but he sold everything with the shop as long as he got to use it until he no longer wanted to, or until he died, and so it's still in his possession. Now, in his younger years, he met my mother, his wife, Marion, and together they went into business. And without the work of my mother, it would have been very difficult for my father to accomplish the business that he was in. He had the design talent, the skills, the artistic skills, but my mother brought with her her ability to manage the business side. She had a background of being an orphan and had to pretty much make it for herself in various environments, and ended up living in a situation where she had to do a lot of work and also had to manage things. And then she went to school and became a secretary and had a job with an attorney. And while she was working for the attorney, my father started his business in 1933, and she did the paperwork and continued to do the paperwork. And they got married in 1936. The shop was operating and functioning and things were going very well at that time. And the reason that things were going well at that time is that aluminum was a little different type of metal. It was a new metal. As we pointed out, it was very expensive earlier, but now it's become less expensive. But the Depression was going on, and during the Depression, people didn't have a lot of money, but they had, some people, the rich people had some money. They couldn't buy silver, but this stuff looked like silver. And so it was a good gift item, it was a new item, and then, so the business really took off at that time. But the need for the support mechanism of the business was very important, and my mother was really an enabler in the whole situation. We always thought we had very little money when we were kids growing up, and it was just stashed in the right place. That's one thing. And the other factor was that when my father left, or was laid off in August, and had to start up the business himself, and he started doing it, there was some legal activity going on, and a suit was considered against my father for starting this business. And it turned out that the attorney that Wendell August used was Attorney Wary, who my mother worked for. In the situation that arose was that the suit wasn't carried out. It was very difficult for that type of suit to win because of its age-old process, and there was nothing really new about it, just the designs that you used. So the business flourished with her help. And without that help, it would have been very difficult for my father to survive, because many businesses did not survive, and part of the reason was the business side was not handled well. So what distinctive contributions did my father make to the hammered aluminum? How can you distinguish his products and what makes them as they are? Let's look at some of the characteristics. I would point out to you that he had some goals as he manufactures things. In the tradition of honest craftsmanship, the aluminum illustrated in this catalog was wrought by hand to be a beautiful adjunct to modern living. In it, a modern metal and modern design are combined with the age-old arts of the skilled craftsman. This happy blending of the old and new has an irresistible appeal for all. You will like this. It's clear-cut design, honest manufacture. And of course, that's why you're here. You like this type of thing. Well, he tried to focus on some very distinctive artistic aspects and craftsmanship. So what he did was make drawings. He focused on outlines a great deal, and then filled in the details. The detailed drawing would be completed before it was applied to the steel metal to be engraved by the steel cutting process. And one of the characteristics is, if you look at some of his products and the design specifically, is that you have some specific detail in the forefront, but as you go in the distance, you have representations of hills or various things, but no specific real close detail in the distance. He then cut the die. This is the die, picture of the die of the Pioneer. And one of his ideas came from Pioneer Dairy, which was the dairy company in Grove City, and had Conestoga wagons and horsemen, and he kind of put it together in this design. And this is the product, the end product. He would design his artwork for a particular tray. It had some restrictions because you had to use it for the tray. It was more difficult to apply it to other products. But I think the overall aspect of my father's work is the trays that he made stand out in the forefront. The other design many of you are familiar with is the map design. This is kind of the origin of it. I found this in his files. It's the September 1930 Lady Holmes Journal. He tore it out, saying he made a collection of many different people's artwork. He took that particular design and made a drawing to suit what he felt he should do, and then added various things, added the compass star, and added the various little animals that are on each of the continents. And if you look at that map design, you see these things if you pay attention to them. Ended up with the final drawing, and then put that drawing on the steel die and cut the die. And this is the die they used to make the map, the end product. Another popular design was the tree. He put this together, composed it together, put various drawings together, came up with a final drawing, and then applied it to the die, cut this die, and then made the final product. The pine design, this particular presentation is poor, but I wanted to present it because it's the design we picked for this week's show, this year's show, and it's the design for the pine. And then he ended up cutting the design. And this is the die that we have over here at our display, and we're using to show the example of the repoussé process. And as you can see, it has the detail in the front, the pine boughs, and as you go back in the distance, you can see that it's just more representation. It has a certain style and characteristic to it that is common to many of his decorations. Another idea for a design came from this newspaper advertisement. I don't know if anybody can place the age of that car. Put it together, it's the snowflakes. He made some drawings, some adaptations, final drawing, and then applied it to the die, and then this is the product that came out of that, one of the products. This is interesting in the way he developed some of his drawings. He would take a work like this as a carving, and then it was more for tapestry, and he ended up with a full design, the tapestry design, which is a very nice representation. So it's quite a number of different designs. He didn't do a large number of designs. When you say large number, it's about 50, maybe 60 drawings, designs throughout the course of his production years. Pretty much focused, made a good drawing and was able to adapt them to good products, as opposed to cutting more and more designs and having multiple products. He stuck pretty much with trays and bowls and waste baskets, magazine racks, some very solid products for the length of his time of production. Then moving from the design to the craftsmanship, it's very important that the crafting of these designs was done well. And this says, as the metal yields to the hammer of the workman, it bears the marks of the skill of his hands. The artisan, guided by the designer, produces an object of beauty and utility. Each piece is individually fashioned and is never exactly duplicated. True craftsmanship is our aim. We hope that you will enjoy it. It was very critical, the way you crafted things. And you look at various different products in the room here, you can tell that there's quite a wide variety of how things were crafted. And the repoussé process was distinctive in terms of hammered aluminum, but people began to duplicate it and using actually more mechanical means of reproducing, getting designs, and they got away from using the repoussé process. So over time, there was a lot of changes took place, but that particular table that man is repoussé still exists, and he used it till the day he quit his shop. One aspect of the repoussé, in addition to the repoussé, is the process called flattering. And the flattering process added to his product. And one of the things that he's always told me is that he sold hammer marks. That's what he sold, hammer marks. If you don't have hammer marks, you don't have hammer aluminum. So various ways of applying hammer marks. One was the repoussé to get the design, and the other was to use the flatter method to kind of blend things together and complete the piece with hammer marks. This is a flatter, and not many other manufacturers use this method. And this is adapted from a process they use in pounding in railroad spikes. but you had to readjust the head, make it, grind it properly, and you had to have them made out of special material because they would split right through here after you used them a while. But he was able to work with a local company that made it was softer on each end and hardened in the middle, so it wouldn't break as frequently, it would last longer. And then the process, you see, you would place this on the aluminum in the appropriate place, and then you would hit it with a sledge, and you'd have a uniform mark as opposed to individually hitting it with a hammer. Here's the process in action, and here's the result. If you look at the trays, many of them will have this line where you have the repoussé part to get the pattern, and then you have the flatter area. So there was kind of a line here. If you didn't put this in, it was kind of ended, then you had the raw metal. But by hitting it with the flatter, you added the hammer marks, which really adds to the beauty of the piece. In addition to the flattering, the methods of putting on the edges on the pieces, and there was a kind of a transition from time as they were learning to do this. This was new ground, and when they put the edges on, used different methods and ways. You can see on this tray, there's a hammer mark here and here and here, and a lot of times they would take and form the tray, and they'd scrape this part with a knife to get it smoother, and then hit it with a hammer and put this design. Then later, they started hitting it directly on the edge, so that you had a design or the imprint of the hammer marks to form the edge, and also made it a little thicker, gave it a little more body. And you can see from this drawing, this is how the hammer marks would be put on the edge. Then it would move to a method of just hitting the edge with putting a tool mark in between each of the hammer marks. And this is, you move from this to this over time. The tool marks were put in, you can see here how the tool marks are put in by hitting with a hammer. And we can show you that today at our demonstration of how that's done. The other area was distinctive was pretty much how he did his handles. And the handles went through a change process too. And in this one, there's a piece of metal that goes all the way across and then wrapped around this bar. This one doesn't have the piece. Well, this was removed because this was more expensive to make than this one. It was easier to make this than that. So you've changed those. You can see that the early tray would have this kind, a little earlier tray, and then the later trays would then have gone to the other. Had another method of putting handles on. This is an extrusion that was made. Then the handle was attached. This whole piece of metal was made this way and then just attached with a ribbon. An extrusion is like a metal aluminum that's squeezed through a die. It would be pushed through a die that looked like this, and it would be pushed through it, and it would come out at the other end in that shape. And many of the pieces that you see here in the room have extrusions, although not many use the extrusions for handles, although I've seen some pieces with the extrusion handles. My father used those quite extensively. And here's kind of a series of progression of different kind of handles, starting with the bar, then an extrusion here. This was a flat bar. Then we went to another type of extrusion that's directly hooked on to the metal, and then down to some that didn't even have any extrusion at all. This was the easiest to make because it didn't take all the steps that you had to go through. This handle, you had to individually hit this extrusion along each of its lines. It was a very nice piece, but it took a lot of time to make. Then some other things that he did with the handles. You see this one is straight. Then he moved to a curved, just a little curve on the handle, made for just some nice ways the piece just looked better that way. And he developed a little device to do that, Here's the handle set in here with a space, and then you would squeeze it between the vise and make the curve on the handle. Those would add certain good touches to the product. During the war, he was not able to produce any products because they took all the aluminum. But during that time he was thinking, and he came up with the idea of using extrusions for the rim around, for the tray, around the tray. And this is what he did. This is an extrusion, and this is the handle, and he had them made so they fit together. And this shows from a side angle. Here's the piece coming around, and it fit right in that handle, and then the other piece would fit together, and you would end up putting a tray together. And I'll show you one of these trays that comes apart like that. So that was pretty distinctive of his work, to use extrusions for the edges and putting it together that way. Once it was together, he held it together by punching, using a punch to drive in the aluminum, and that would hold it all together. And he would form these in a special device that was made specifically for it because it had to fit the contour of the extrusion, put the bar in, and then by pulling these handles around, he would be able to bend the metal just the right amount to fit around the tray. Move on to the type of corners. It originally started out with a kind of a curved corner and some square corners. Square corners were very difficult to make originally with aluminum, even though the metal was easy to shape, but you got all deformed. You had to do it correctly, and then you got a peak sticking out, and you had to file it off and then rehammer the edges. And so over time, he developed a different type of edge. You'll see some of these curved ones will have a kind of a scallop edge too, to deal with how to make an edge with some different pattern to it. Here's one with the square corners. Then he moved to a tray that accomplished a number of things for him, is that he made the corner kind of a different type of contour so that when you bent it, you didn't have to do anything to it after it was done. And then he added just a curve on this side of the tray, or on the sides of the tray. Then he had the extrusion, and then it would fit right in the tray. Then you would hit the handle to fit it on there, and it made for a nice process. And he made these trays for over 20 years, and they were a very good product. After the products were put together, or in the process of putting together, you had to finish them. And a number of the products are very shiny. People polish these things. They find them dirty, and they think they have to make them real shiny. Well, in reality, the process of finishing aluminum was to make it dirty and then clean some of the dirt off, but not all of it. And if you put this in the fire, right at the right place, in the right kind of fire, in terms of the right temperature, and put it at the right level of the heat, you could get the coal tar onto the aluminum and it would stick. If you did it if it was too hot, it wouldn't stick. If it was too cold, it wouldn't stick. You had to get it at the exact spot for a certain length of time. And once you did that, the coal tar was on the aluminum, and then you would clean it off as some of it, but it would stick in the design. It gave a nice antique appearance and had a nice characteristic. And we have one tray in our display that's on the wall of the horses that was made in 1936, and that's the way the trays are supposed to look. You wouldn't take that tray and scrub it off and make it shiny. That's the way they were originally meant to be. Now, some people like shiny trays, so you make them shiny. But you don't have a way to make them colored again. A lot of them have gone through a lot of usage, and so you just have to do with what you can. But right now, this process was the area that Wendell August tried to patent. And it was just determined that really you can't patent this type of process. People have been doing it. They put stuff in the fire and hammer it and do all kinds of things with it. So that never lasted. But the other thing that happened is that other companies didn't know this, and they paid a lot of money to try to find out how this was done. And one of my father's workers, which I'll show you later, went to Everlast, told him how it was done. They paid him $5,000, and he lost his job. In addition to finishing, using the fire and the steel wool and this type of thing, my father moved into gold anodizing in about 1952 to 56, when most aluminum companies went under. And Wendell August was very close to going under and was salvaged by changing their strategy. My father moved into gold anodizing, and we have a display of some of the products that are anodized. He did that from 1952, 56 on, and that's how he survived that particular time. Gold anodizing is a process of electrolytically oxidizing the aluminum, making it harder, opening the pores in the metal, and then putting a dye. You put a dye in it, different colors. We use hundreds of products that are anodized aluminum. If you don't anodize it, it oxidizes on its own and it tarnishes and just doesn't hold up in the weather. But you put this anodized process, oxidize this thin, the surface, the coat, anodize it. It is much harder, lasts longer. It's not a plating, it's actually right in the metal. You can cut through it. It led to new problems because you had to use a chemical process and you didn't have the resources to do in a large scale, and you had to use other people to do it, and that was very difficult to get people who are used to anodizing TV antennas to anodize a product that you put your whole process into, and the last process was anodizing, and if you went wrong, you lost all the work that you put into it. But over the latter part of the time he worked, he made many products that were anodized. You recognize the old designs, yet at the same time, they were anodized aluminum. What were some of the business aspects that are distinctive? Again, he focused on the craftsmanship and the artistry of making products. He used various ways of marking his products. And this shows he originally just had an A. And then it moved to an A with his name. And the name stands out with the background imprinted in. And he had two stamps like that. He needed two because he had two people repasaying at the same time. And when this one broke, he went and made another product or another stamp that had the letters directly in. If you look in the back of the trays, you will see the different types of marks. And if you have this kind of mark, it's very early products. And then this is in the mid-30s on up into the 40s, early 50s, and then in the early 50s he switched to this mark. There are some trays and products marked with stamps that don't have his name on it. There's 3 of them here that I know about. Just found about a 4th one just 2 weeks ago, and it's McLean Brick Company. And one of the participants here showed me a tray, pine tray with it on the back, and it was interesting to see it. I just found it. I haven't found the stamp. We have these 3 stamps, but I don't have the other stamp, but I have an example of it. These are the stamps. We have one of them here to demonstrate what they look like. The repasay table and the die, the hammers. This is the original price list that he had of August 17th, 1933. And his original tray, wild geese, $2.40. You'll find some of those in flea markets for that. What is it worth now? Probably, you've seen some of them marked, $90, $120, $60, depending on the shape that they're in. But they're a nice product. We have an example of one that I found in Vermont before we really got deeply into this aspect of my father's business and didn't know a whole lot about it as much as I know now. We found it for $1. And when I was interviewing my father, I didn't know it was the original tray that he made, that design. And when I found out about that, then the value just went up. As you can see, some of the other designs, here was a schooner. He used his examples that he used for Window August. Seahorses, he made his own seahorses. Another wild geese tray. That the difference here was whether they had a handle or not. And he made some other little designs of these coasters that have single designs, a fleur-de-lis, some anchors, a lion on it. You see them around, just the little coasters, and those are very early. The shop had associated with it an office at my our house in the backyard. We had a garage, and this is where the office where my mother worked many hours, keeping track of all the business aspect. In 1947, this picture was taken of some of the workers he had. Most of the workers, we had 28 or maybe 20, 28 workers in the 30s. In the 40s, right after the war, it was real big business, but it dropped off in the late 1940s, and then the employment really would drop down. But a couple of the employees, George Hunter, he was the one that was pictured, the man repasing. Leroy Barnes was an employee for over 40 years. He previously worked for Window August and came to work for my father. And he died this in January. And then Jimmy Vincent started working for my father when he was 13. It wasn't child labor. He just came around the shop and was an interested person and just started sweeping and things, and progressively ended up working. He liked to do the finishing. And the products that we brought for the show, the limited edition, he did the finishing work on it in terms of after they were colored. Who were some of the other people right at the same time that did this type of work? Of course, Window August was there. My father worked there for the 6 months. And some people from Window August left and did their own work. Natal Rossi and one of the blacksmiths, Tony, left and went back to Brockway. They tried to go into business for about 1 year. Made a product that had an HC on it. If you find any products with HC, they were made by Natal Rossi and this other blacksmith. It didn't do too well. They just didn't have the resource, they didn't have the marketing, they didn't have the know-how, they didn't have the design skills that it took. They had the know-how to do it in terms of the physical labor, but they didn't have the design process. After a while, Natal's sister convinced him to come back to Grove City, and he worked for Window August for many years. One of the other contemporaries was Arthur Palmer. Many of you are acquainted with Palmer Smith. This is trademark, you can see there. It was Arthur Palmer. He was a salesman for Window August and did a very good job. He was really the person that got it out onto the market, the New York market. He was a man that was liked elegant things, nice things, table settings, and various other things. And he would market the products. In fact, he'd give him ideas of things he ought to make. And just for kind of a sideline, you can see this candlestick on his catalog. Very ornate, and it took a lot of work to do that. Of course, you went out of business doing that. You couldn't make those things. Even with handmade things, you wanted to make a nice product. You couldn't make everything you ever desired to make. And what happened was that in the process of selling this product, he was making more than what Window August was making. And so they had a kind of a parting of the ways. And he went into business himself and made various products. And they're different, they're interesting. They have a history in themselves. And somebody needs to maybe record all that type of things. The other aspect is, why is he called Palmer Smith? His name was Arthur Smith Palmer. My father's name was Arthur Smith Armour. Arthur Smith Palmer, Arthur Smith Armour, whose business is it? So he used Palmer Smith, his last name and his middle name, for his business. Another contemporary was Clayton Sheasley. This is Clayton Sheasley in March of this year. He visited him in Florida. He came to work for my father in about 1936 when things were tight and not many jobs, but he started working for him and then left, had a reason to move to Pittsburgh, and then started making aluminum in Pittsburgh, and eventually moved to Slippery Rock, which is about 9 miles from Grove City, and he manufactured things. The most production was after the war until 1950. He eventually sold things to another contemporary who was, here's an example of some of Sheasley's products, and I'll come back to what happened to him. There's another person involved, you can't read it, I tried to produce it, it's Leroy DeLoss, and they started a business in Embleton, Pennsylvania, which is about 25 miles or so from Grove City, and in the 30s, and it didn't thrive too well, but they had a person cutting the dies whose name was Robert Hall. He was from Slippery Rock. He had a small business, he didn't make a whole lot of things, but he cut dies for others, particularly the Laws. And what happened there, well, I'll tell you as we unfold. Another worker for my father was John Finley. John Finley, he worked for my father, and he's the one who went to Everlast and told him how to put the finish on, and came back and bragged about it and lost his job. He went and started making aluminum in a little town of Sandy Lake and Stoneboro, right north of Grove City. But he had ability to do refaceting, but he didn't have any design ability, so he had to go to somebody else to make his designs. So what he did, he had somebody else cut them and copy other people's designs. You notice the sailboat? Well, that's the same sailboat that my father had. If you'll notice, it doesn't have a little sailboat beside it, and it doesn't have the smooth curves and things that my father's design had. Here's some geese. They look like my father's geese, but they aren't. The major way is the way that the tool marks and also the legs aren't the same. The other person that was contemporary was DePonso. And Jim DePonso came to work for my father from Window August. He originally was from Brockway. He came with Window August, and then moved to my father's shop. Was a very hard worker, very good worker, and really contributed to the business. But when the war came, when everybody was shut down, he, of course, he lost his job. He went to work for the Cooper Bessemer, and but then when the war was over, he started his own business. He was planning to start his own business before the war came, but the war came and interrupted that. Well, in the process of his life, he met his current wife, who happened to be the wife of Robert Hall. Robert Hall cut the dies for DeLoss. And he cut a number of other dies and things for himself, but he died. And she sold these dies, and DePonso came to see them. Not only did he buy the dies, he married the wife of the man that had cut them. And they currently live up in Chautauqua. DePonso made products that were in Grove City, from Grove City, until 1950 approximately, and he decided to get out of the business as a full-time occupation and kept it as an avocation, and went to school to become a school teacher in special education, moved to Chautauqua, New York, where he currently has a little shop, and we visited him in February of this past year. The interesting thing was that when I was there, here's the actual die that Finley had made that copied my father's sailboat and geese. And here's a comparison between their sailboat and my father's sailboat. And it's maybe a little hard to see it, but I have them on the table, and you can see that there is a distinct difference. And he used this motif in various products, and sometimes you just wonder where they came from. But they were cut separately, and they were just pretty much a copy, but there are differences, so there's nothing to prevent you from doing that. All right, there were the contemporaries that were at the same time. There was a few other kind of small people. A lot of people did it in their basements. My father was pretty liberal with the people. They could make products of their own if they wanted to. And as long as they just paid for the metal and they could work at it and make things. My father created a lot of other things that as he went through life, he applied his artistic skill to aluminum. One of which was the Stag and Doe. This is a 4-foot plaque that was made for a restaurant in Sharon. One of his architect friends came to him and said, would you make this plaque for the Stag and Doe restaurant? So he executed, you can see the flatter marks, the extrusions, there's hammered edges. This is actually relief cut out. And if you use your imagination, you know, where really it's a nice product. And I didn't know where it was, and the Stag and Doe restaurant had been torn down, a redevelopment, started looking for it, but in the process of gathering material about my father's business, I went to visit Bill Connect at Window August, and I walked right through the reception area and didn't pay attention, went into his office, and in the course of our conversation, he said, I want to show you something out here. He took me out and showed me this. He didn't know where it came from, he wasn't sure. He spent a lot of time and effort getting it, but I said, well, my father made that. Well, it was taken back a little bit, and there was no mark on it as to who made it, but it was definitely all the materials that my father made, and he had told me about it. And so I got the two together, and sure enough, that was a product that my father made. But how did he put the finish on that one with the smoke? They did it out in the alley over a barrel, and to get the smoke on it. The other aspect about it is too how good your imagination is. It doesn't take much once you see it, but if you think about Kensington ware, here's the stag from the Kensington ware, and the trademark, and also the plate that has a stag on it. This is an exact duplication of that, a duplication of it with the doe, just stag flipped. And we didn't realize that until after last year's show here. We were just looking at one of the plates, and my father said, you know, that looks like the stag on that plate. And what had happened is the architect had drawn it, or gotten it and enlarged it, or did whatever, and brought it to my father, and he executed it. Of course, it has some of the other flair to it, and he used his skills to put it all together. It's a very nice piece. It was a very interesting find. And my father didn't do too many of these larger special projects. Another project he did was the Signs of Apostles for a railing in a church building in Greenville, which is about 15, 20 miles from Grove City. And he made them kind of a shields of apostles. This is for Christ. And then the other apostles, and it's for other 12 apostles scattered on this railing. And they're cut out, but they're aluminum and they're handcrafted. And they're very nice products. They still exist in this church. This is our home in Washington Boulevard in Grove City. My father moved into that on his wedding day. And my mother, as I pointed out to you, was very frugal and conserved her money. And there was a depression. The developer of this little area of Grove City had gone bankrupt. And this was the house he had made for himself. He had to sell it. And she had $5,000 to buy it. And they were able to move into it, and it has progressively gone through a transformation of my father's input to the house. over time, and even you have to kind of imagine things, but really everything is kind of added. These are he manifested, the letters on the, there's a lot of things that happen. The windows were added, a particular use of industrial windows. The whole house is, over time, has been transformed with various products that he did, and you could sit in one room and find 50 things that he did. Of course, I would point out to you that in this whole process, very supported by his wife, my mother, and this whole transformation just took time. We saw it happen as we lived through it as children growing up. Some of the applications that he took the horses and cut them out. They're mounted on over one of the mirrors. He had made a special he made a carving of a horse's head, and then made castings of it. He had 50 castings made, and they were applied to various things in the house. This was more of a creative piece of aluminum work. They were cut out, and then the edges along here were just turned under. It's much the idea of the stag and doe, and it's a nice product. A mobile made out of horses. Another aspect that's very significant in our lives and the lives of my father and mother was a cabin in Hemlock Valley. And of course the sign, "Robbers Beware," is aluminum. And in this valley is a cabin, which he designed, and he was a follower of Frank Lloyd Wright, and some principles are incorporated in this. And he designed this cabin and spent a lot of time just building it, overseeing the building, and we spent many Saturdays there. It sits in a valley, separated from other cottages. You cannot drive to it. You have to walk down over the hill, 80-some steps, to get to the cabin, and you keep it in its natural environment. And the different perspectives of the cabin. We had a swinging bridge to get across to the spring. This is the inside of the cabin. There's a painting of the cabin inside, which he did, and this is somewhat what it looks like. It's a little dark picture, but it shows the way the cabin looked and the other direction. Some of the things around the cabin, again, the light was, he made that out of aluminum products. Many of the things were made. Here's a outside light, gas light. This is made out of aluminum. This is a bell with aluminum straps holding it together. This is the cabin in the winter. We would go there all year round. It's only 14 miles from home, so it was very accessible. The waterfalls in the front, under snow, the same picture we had before, but with the snow covered. The waterfalls in the front, swinging bridge, cabin from the stream across from the other valley. It's a rather steep ravine that the cabin is in. So let's put it all together in relationship to what my father did. I would point out that as my father lived through life, he did have a view of life that is very critical, as everyone should have. Each of you have a view of life. You may not know it, but you do have it. How you view where you came from, what you're doing here, where you're going. Those are very real questions. And this was reflected in much of what my father did and how he conducted his business. He had a worldview that focused on Almighty God, who created the world. He really put into his work his whole heart. He worked in this shop for many years, and this shop still exists. It's like an archaeological dig. You can find all these things in there. And he had a great relationship with one of his employees, Leroy Barnes, worked for 40 years for him. A very, very supportive person, and worked with a very skilled craftsman. He didn't have artistic skills. He had craftsman skills, and he was very precise and could do many things. You wouldn't have the wastebaskets that we have around that my father made if it wasn't for him. Because they had a hard time forming those, and people had different ideas, but he said, you give me these things and I'll make them for you. And he was able to do it. And they made them for many years. He used all these tools, his trademarks, his design of the world. And I think this is significant because my father had a world and life view, a world view of the creator, regarding the creator who made this universe. And there is such thing as truth. And it is eternal. And we can't just exist here as human beings. Life is very, very valuable. I experience it frequently. I'm a physician, family practice, do obstetrics, do deliveries, and it's a miracle of life. Life is very, very valuable. And our society is losing it. And what happens in our society, too, is that we fail to recognize that Almighty God does exist, and He's visited us in His Word and in His Son, Jesus Christ. And without knowing Him, you're headed in the wrong direction. As His design was to enjoy life, not only to do craft work, but His whole life was involved with this focus. And the quote up there says, those people who exclude the Creator from the equation are starving to death spiritually. If you think you're finding your own way by yourself, you'll come to a dead end. And there is a way to life. And my father espoused that way of life. He was a craftsman, and he expressed his submission to Almighty God in his stewardship of conducting his business. Our family was living together in this environment, my father working, making his own business, my mother providing the support work. I have one older brother, an older sister, and a younger sister. Nancy was here this afternoon, or this morning, and we all benefited from the worldview that my father had, and we have a great heritage, and we would hope that our country would not waver from that heritage that was built upon, but we're in awful shaky ground today. In our working together, this is my son, who is helping to make the commemorative trays that we have here today. And in the process of all this, over the course of the last year, this looks like one of your rooms in your house. This is actually the packing room up in my father's shop, and there's some of the things that we collected in the process of trying to find the good things. And we all know what that is like, and it's been an interesting process to see what has been out there, and I learned a lot, even from, coming from shows like this. And I would hope that in the process of time, that we really learn from each other as this whole area of hammered aluminum unfolds. Dad's shop had a significant contribution to my life, and as you people search, you find some interesting things, and we're really happy for this opportunity to share with you some of the distinctive things that my father did as he attempted to apply his artistic skill to the media of die cutting, hammered aluminum, come up with products that have quality and have beauty to them. And it was from this shop and from the workplace at home for my mother that he was able to survive through the times that many other businesses disappeared, and he has truly made a distinctive contribution. Those of you who weren't here this morning, this is a plaque that he had made to give to Danny Woodard and to Ed Gangaware. It consists of the pine design mounted in a frame that he had from his shop that he had made for Palmer Smith. Arthur Palmer had him make frames for him, and he had some of these kicking around there, and he adapted it to this and made them for both of them. And we want to extend our congratulations to them for what they have done to promote the art and craft collection of hammered aluminum. Thank you very much. If we could have the lights turned on.